Welcome to today's virtual event, From Polarization to Collaboration, Philanthropy's Role in Bridging Differences. We will begin in just a minute. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the session, please send a direct chat to me or feel free to email us at webinars@cof.org. There is automated live transcript available through the options at the bottom of the Zoom screen to select show subtitles or view full transcript. If you need any assistance, please feel free to reach out or stay in the large room when we do breakouts. Our team will be happy to support you. This event is being recorded and will be shared to all participants and on our website as a resource afterwards. The breakout room discussions are not going to be recorded. As a reminder, please stay muted throughout the large session unless you are in the smaller group breakouts. Otherwise, if you have any comments throughout today's discussion, please utilize the Zoom chat feature. At this time, I will hand it over to Kristen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Scott Kennedy, Chief of Staff and VP of Strategy and Organizational Effectiveness at the Council. And I am so excited to welcome you to today's webinar on philanthropy's role in bridging differences. At the Council, we believe that philanthropy must be a leader in seeing our shared humanity and working together for the greater good. But we also know that positive change also requires action from a broad coalition of people and groups, including those with whom we sometimes disagree. We think that the magic happens at the intersections where we can build common ground, and the Council is working to be that intersection with the goal of supporting philanthropy to come together across differences, actively listen to one another, and collaborate to move us forward as a society. And we're really excited to do this work with partners like the Greater Good Science Center and feature members like the Einhorn Collaborative to bring this work to life by offering programs like this interactive discussion and the upcoming Bridging Differences Leadership Cohort. So today's conversation is going to be facilitated by Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith. Among other accomplishments, Allison is a senior fellow at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, where she focuses on developing and implementing the science of bridging. She is joined in conversation by Jonathan Gruber, strategy lead for building at the Einhorn Collaborative, and Reverend Brandon Polk, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Fellow for Free Speech and Peace at Stand Together. So thank you all for joining us today. And Allison, I will pass it over to you.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm just going to go ahead and kind of welcome us into the space a little bit and encourage us to come on in and get comfortable. Encourage you all to notice where you're sitting or standing and to do the things that help you feel like you can be present and grounded. So I invite you all to turn on your screens if that's available. We don't mind seeing dogs, cats, children, cars, whatever you are, so go ahead and make yourself available if you can. And if not, we also understand that as well. So I'm just going to spend just a couple minutes kind of getting us grounded and getting us kind of ready for the conversation that we're about to have. So let me just begin by introducing myself again. My name is Allison Briscoe-Smith, and I am a child clinical psychologist. And I begin with that because it's a space that I'm oriented to and paying attention to. And actually what brings me to the space today is how we can actually create spaces of bridging, connecting across our differences for our own wellness and the wellness of our children who are watching and witnessing as well. I'm a senior fellow at the Greater Good Science Center, and that basically means that I've had the opportunity to partner with the Greater Good Science Center over the course of my career, which has spanned moving back and forth between academia and running programs, but has also really been very much interested on this fundamental question of how do we expand our love for each other? How do we connect with each other? What we do at Greater Good Science Center is to try to take the basics of the science of wellness and science of how to connect and share that with others. So I'm in this space to both kind of learn and to capitalize upon the knowledge and wisdom of those of you in this space as well. Our hopes for this entire kind of space, both today and some of the opportunities that we're going to have in the future, are to really think about and to make the case for why philanthropy needs bridging skills, has the opportunity to leverage bridging skills, and to bring folks together across our divides. We really want to raise awareness about this work and kind of make available to you the science and the wisdom that you have here. Also to think about philanthropy and some of the case studies and opportunities that are therein. And again, to kind of refine, take a look at, and pay attention to the tools that we have to do this, especially as we think about, again, connecting ourselves across big differences, as well as small ones too. So as we kind of get started, I'd love for folks to enter into the chat. If you would want to go ahead and put your name, you can put the organization that you're working with or any other things that you want us to know about. But we are going to try to find some opportunities for us to kind of connect. So people could start entering again into the chat. We'll take a look at that and just see who's in the space. We will, in terms of our kind of run of show and what we're doing today, is that we're going to get an opportunity to hear from our honored guests, to hear about the work that they've been doing. We'll be in dialogue with them for a bit. And then you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions through the chat, ask questions of each other. And then again, as a means of kind of creating community and bringing folks together, you'll have an opportunity to connect with each other in breakout groups, where we'll have kind of guided questions that we're going to offer to you, both on these kind of issues of bridging and also creating community. So that's the arc of what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to give you all just a moment to kind of take a look at to who your homies are in the chat here. You can also do, things like a wave and say, hi, hey, you, we want to go ahead and connect with each other as much as possible. So I see folks kind of putting in, take a moment just to read that and bear witness to who's here. So as we do that, getting a chance to see how many folks are here from how many different places, I'm really excited to turn to our guest and have an opportunity to really learn from and hear from them and the work that they've done to create the New Pluralist. So we're going to start with that. I mean, perhaps some folks have heard about New Pluralist. I'm hoping that everybody has, but I'm really intrigued to hear about the origin story. So we've got our two guests here who are going to talk a little bit about that. John and Brandon, welcome to the space. Really, really excited to have you both here. But want to begin, can you tell us a little bit about what New Pluralist is and how it got started?
Yes, sounds great. Thanks, Allison. Great to be with you all. Terrific group. Fun to see all of the introductions coming through in the chat. John Gruber with Einhorn Collaborative, and been involved in New Pluralist since the early days. So New Pluralist is a funder and field collaborative that's focused on strengthening a culture of pluralism in American life amidst the ongoing overlapping forces of division, distrust, dehumanization, disconnection. We're now a collaborative of about 17 and growing funders, as well as 60 plus field leaders, nonprofit leaders, researchers, storytellers, thought leaders, who represent different domains across the pluralism ecosystem, who we engage in really substantive ways in the shared work. And we're also a kind of microcosm of the broader field that we're trying to nurture and strengthen. The collaborative launched in April of last year, but the origin story dates back to the aftermath of the 2016 election. So a few of us stand together, Einhorn and other funders, we're active, we're deepening our work, our investment in the pluralism and bridging space on the heels of that highly divisive election moment. And while we could tell that there was this burgeoning, growing ecosystem of actors who were working to strengthen what I refer to as the human side of a healthy democracy, it was also very clear that that was an under-resourced and under the radar field of activity. And most of the philanthropic attention and resources were flowing to other first order priorities around shoring up and defending democracy, advancing equity, and all really powerful priorities. And yet here was this pocket of work that was getting short shrift. And so a few of us came together, 4 funders initially in the spring of 2020, just as the first wave of the pandemic was descending, to say, what would it look like to not just bring more resources and visibility and legitimacy to this crucial area of work to strengthen pluralism, but also to do so in a way where we're actually modeling and embracing the very norms and mindsets and practices that we want to spread out in the world. And so from the get-go, by design, we brought together a very eclectic and unlikely mix of philanthropic partners to sit at the table together and to try to envision and shape what a shared project could be that ultimately became New Pluralist. And the other thing I'll say about the origin is that I think we found ourselves right out of the gate kind of intuitively drawing on some of the practices and skills that Allison, you and your team have so helpfully popularized and are spreading to the wider world. When it comes to defining shared goals, common goals that we can actually work toward together, getting to know each other as human beings and individuals, getting past some of the assumptions we might have about our particular group identities, thinking about what it looks like to define shared values and actually name those and practice them and hold ourselves accountable. All some of the hallmarks that we know goes into effective, high quality bridging experiences. And for me personally, that was one of the most rewarding aspects from the early days and being part of this work. I've been funding and studying and talking and writing about bridging work for several years and lead up to launch a new pluralist, but building relationships with people like Brandon and Sarah from Stand Together and others around the table was one of the first real direct experiences that I got to have engaged in this work and not just talking about it and supporting it.
Thank you. We'd love to hear from you, Brandon, as your sense of how things got going.
Yeah, quite crazily. I think, John gave a really aspirational and honest and authentic portrayal of what actually happened. But I think we all remember, what those 2016, 2017, what those years were really like, from the political election to things like Charlottesville. And there were a number of us that were investing in organizations, of course, to try and, mitigate for this problem of growing toxic polarization. And then we found ourselves like investing in some of the same groups and organizations, so as we were, going to different events and having conversations, realizing that there was a lot of crossover, that was one of the drivers for coming together and really thinking, what we really should see if there's a way for us to work together as members of Philanthropy to see if there's a way to force multiply our impact together. I think that what we discovered, to John's point, is that we were intuitively drawing on some of the skills, the tools for conversation, for dialogue, and then quickly realized, that in order for us to really pull back the veil on what it would look like to bring other participants in, other funders, other field builders, that it was going to take a deeper set of skills, but mostly an articulation of our values and our principles across lines of difference. So basically, it wasn't just enough to say it, which we had to work hard on saying what it was that we meant that was valuable in terms of vision and principles for what we want to see as the ideal state moving forward in the culture of the country. Culture of belonging is what we call it. But those deeper practices were something that we also had to engage with as funders across the table with different philosophies, different ways of doing work, different degrees of rigor, different outcomes that we wanted to see. And actually doing that work relationally is actually how we got to the new pluralist.
Can you talk us through, both of you, a little bit more about that, some of the kind of values that perhaps were being articulated? You're talking from, the values, but having to kind of manifest that relationally. Were there guiding principles that you all came up with? How did you all get to that place?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in quickly, and then John is really good at articulating what those principles are. But I'd say just a little bit about our process, right? There were, to John's point, and just a number of us around the table that really felt committed to continue the conversation. 4 or 5 of us that we are core funders of this initiative. We needed a facilitator. We needed an objective participant. That was going to take us, from start to finish along this journey, to basically ask us some key questions. What is it? Why is it? And how are we going to do it? And that process, proved to a certain degree we could have those conversations on our own, but to really get to a point of sufficiency in understanding what the principles were, what the values were, and then what container we were going to actually create in order to hold that and to bring the right stakeholders together, in order to operationalize on what we're now calling a theory of change to help us build that culture of belonging in the country. So we did have a set of core values and principles. I'll toss to John to really articulate that, but which I'm really excited about because it's sort of like our North Star. It's what I'm calling sort of the lighthouse effect, through the darkest night and the densest fog, that when we get lost, we can always come back, to these 5 principles.
Excellent. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for putting this slide up. So these 5 guiding principles, one of the early pieces of content, like conceptual thinking and content that we shaped together around the funder circle as we were envisioning what this work could be and what could anchor it. And to Brandon's point, we drew a lot of inspiration and insight from the organizations and efforts that many of us have been supporting and learning from over the course of many years. These, I think, are hallmarks of powerful, effective, authentic bridging and pluralism work in action. And then we held the mirror up to ourselves and said, what would it look like to actually live these principles in how we go about the work with each other? So take one example, finding strength and difference. I think a lot of the sort of barriers to effective engagement across difference is seeing disagreements in certain areas or in certain policies or issues as a kind of non-negotiable for being able to find common cause in other ways or other places. And yet the ability to do that, right, to find ways to work together, to live together, to be in relationship with one another, despite perhaps some fundamental differences, we would argue is actually a fundamental tenet of a healthy pluralistic culture. And so, we had a bunch of different kinds of voices and perspectives and backgrounds around the table from the early days, not just ideological differences, but different institutional types, different theories of change, different core priorities. And yet we were able to say, what would it look like for us to lock arms and get behind a body of work together that we all are passionate about and care about and think is needed in the world? And that's what led to shaping a vision and strategy for what became New Pluralists. And so these guiding principles continue to ground us in all the work that happens across the collaborative. We cite them internally amongst the funder and field builder community and how we come together in courageous conversations with one another. They animate the grant making and action taking that we're doing out in the world. For example, through the Healing Starts Here RFP, that was one of our first big investment initiatives this past year. And they remain a healthy but living touchstone for all the work.
Let's lean into one of that you kind of lifted up. It's in part the piece around differences that are called out most clearly, which is finding strength in difference. I think many of us are here in this space because we were part of exhausted majorities that don't like the polarization that is really happening, looking to, I love this idea of light and beacons as to how this can happen. But this is a place I want to dig in a little bit more, like, legit, how did you bring folks that were really ideologically different to the table, or how did you sneak up to their table? How did you end up bringing folks in? Were these principles helpful in that, or how is it that we do that? That's kind of what we want to kind of dive into. Really kind of, I've heard the language of expanding the tent, broadening the table. What did you all do to do that? If you could both kind of weigh in.
Yeah, I'll just start. This is one of my favorite parts of the story, which is we could talk about principles all day. A lot of us do, in our organizations or in our work. We have a set of norms, values that we're able to speak on, right? But the doing of this and the practice of this is really challenging when you get to deeper layers, right? So as funders, as practitioners, right, in this bridging work, the more we had these conversations about, certain hot topic issues, whether it was race or diversity, it was clear that pluralism was not a synonymous term, for these things that were really hot button for a lot of people, things that we're concerned about. But rather pluralism, not only in the values, not only in the principles, but in the practice, right, gets really, really hard to do. And how we brought people to the table, I think, is through our own storytelling about the value creation that we did together, right? So having an objective like facilitator was a part of the journey, but we were really in the thick of it. Like I said, there's no way to escape the relational component here. There's no way to escape a level of craft, in having these conversations across lines of difference. There's no substitute for valuing those differences when you learn that the people that are different from you across the table are not your enemy, that there's a sense of striving for a similar sum, for a greater sum, a sense of shared value and shared fate that we were all discovering together as people that were a part of the initial effort, especially as funders. But then as we've opened up or widened the circle, so I'm using the principles language here, we've widened the circle and other folks have come in, we've demonstrated and told a story about a a self-interested value for our organizations and for us as people, that as we begin to lean in and practice these principles, that there's a lot of value that we feel intrinsically, we feel more fulfilled. It's very exciting to see what other people can onboard to that, and then be able to see how their organizations are actually deploying these values and their principles in real practice, that keeps us away from contributing to the polarization or to what the collaboration gaps might be through our work, which is a lot more rewarding. And I think that we can have not just a tracking or a measurement of it, but a feeling of doing good in the world that I think we're all here to do and really be about. That's why our field, quote unquote, exists, is to create good, if not to do it for everyone, not just for certain segments of the population around certain issues. But if one of us is failing or one group of us is failing, then we're all failing. And we believe that a culture of belonging is an important way to move that work forward. Not only do we know it, but we've experienced it too.
Sounds like you feel it as well as what
Feel
I'm
it.
hearing. Yes.
Yeah.
I would add, I think it's helpful to invoke the exhaustive majority concept, as you did, Allison, from the more in common research, because I think as much as there was a high degree of difficulty in what we were trying to do together, there was also a real yearning and hunger amongst at least a subset of folks in the funder community who wanted to engage in this way, who wanted to lean into some of the differences and perceptions and tensions that we know pervade. I think philanthropy in many ways mirrors some of the social fractures and divisions that we see in the broader society. And for those of us who are already investing in or exploring the pluralism and bridging space as a place to fund and to learn from, I think there was a strong pull, right, to be able to say, let's not just engage in this work as funders or as social change actors, but let's actually try to live this work as well. And that's an ongoing challenge and journey, no doubt. But it's been one of the most distinctive and I think rewarding aspects of our shared work together.
Can I say just one more thing on the heels of that is the opposite ends up being, true without this sense of guiding principles or North Star, or the lighthouse effect, right? Sort of that beacon effect, is that it would be easy, I think, for any of us in philanthropy or in our lives, to fall into sort of the trap of not being constructive or contributing to toxic polarization or collaboration divides or exacerbating problems across the board. Without a sense, right, of story and narrative that really roots us and grounds us in the potential of what this could be, that is an alternative to what we've been experiencing as the exhaustive majority, right? So if there's no hope in the future, right, I think that this is sort of a picture that we can paint on a really large canvas, of how many voices, many different types of people with many different types of background, with a set of principles and skills that have to be practiced well over time, can actually build a culture of belonging that promotes not just the values, but solutions to complex problems in ways we really need to see and feel progress.
Mm-hmm. You've both invoked this kind of sense of feeling, from the kind of personal to the storytelling. And I'm curious whether or not there are any stories that come to mind for you, stories that you feel like animate this work, stories that you feel like you want to offer to this group. Are there examples or stories? And they don't have to be kind of perfect stories. They don't have to be ones like, and then we were healed. But are there stories that you feel like are emerging, that are showing up, that you think you'd want to kind of share with us as we're thinking about this?
Yeah, I'll offer one. I think the process we went through, not just amongst the funders, but in deep partnership with many of our field builders and with the New Pluralist team, in defining and designing the Healing Starts Here investment initiative, was, I think, a great illustration of pluralistic engagement in action. So not necessarily because we were navigating really fraught differences about what that initiative should be, but simply realizing that the divergence of perspectives and ideas around the circle would get us to a more creative and more ambitious and more thoughtful solution for what that could be. So, we are a national funder and field collaborative, mostly national foundations. Many of the field builder organizations work nationally, and yet we had a hunch and a belief early on that we need to be able to support work on the ground in communities. And that's where most people experience pluralism or lack thereof. right? And the social collisions they have in their neighborhoods and schools and workplaces and so on. And so we set out to figure out how might we design a national investment initiative that could get resources down to the ground, to grassroots community-based organizations doing pluralism work, often not invoking the language or frame of pluralism or bridging, but finding different expressions of that work. And the team very thoughtfully brought in community-based leaders, relational organizers, nonprofit leaders from different corners of this ecosystem to work in partnership with the funders and the team to envision what this could be. And we arrived at, I think it was a really powerful and exciting investment initiative. We are about to announce a set of initial grants to projects, I think, in 20 plus countries or states across the country. And I think that is a great example of channeling strength through difference, right? And like widening the circle, the aperture of who's involved and the ideas we bring in to shape the actual shared work. And that's one of the most exciting aspects for me, is getting to more creative and ambitious, thoughtful problem-solving ideas by virtue of living these principles.
That's a fantastic kind of example, and one that I even see folks kind of nodding to as to the opportunities that are provided there. Brandon, is there one that kind of comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think there, of course, are a lot. As the Reverend, I won't do like a Hallelujah, we're healed story, but pretty close. But even getting to Healing Starts Here, right, which was sort of a mammoth of a project, for the new pluralist team, which we could, give a ton of nods and name a lot of names about how that work has come to be. It's really amazing to see the outcome there. Leading into that, though, just leaning on practice just a bit, during the 2020, 2021 kind of era, we were looking at sort of the current ecosystem of field builders and funders as it stood, and said, we have to figure out what the best way is to start having some conversations, about things like race and diversity, and these are fraught, like conversations, depending on what perspective you're bringing to the table or from where in the house you are sitting, to pull on a MLK quote, on his in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, saying that we're a part of the same house, part of the world house. Again, easy to talk about it, a lot different to actually implement or practice it. Bringing up a conversation about race from a more left of center or right of center point of view, we were able to have that conversation, a series of conversations, which we called courageous conversations, where we were able to really reflect and invite a right of center point of view on what's going on in the world around the issue of race and diversity. We were able to counter that, with a conversation from a left of center point of view about what it means to sort of be involved in this conversation and do good work around race and diversity. And then genius, which is to say, let's actually blow up the archetypes. And why are we actually leaning on these labels and these binaries to communicate our lived experience, the way we connect with one another as people, right? So we were, I don't know, kind of challenging ourselves at the end of it all to say that we are not the sum of these labels that we tend to use. We are something more than that. And as a result, I think we get things like Healing Starts Here, right? Where we're bringing other people in, widening that circle of engagement, where we hope to sort of burst those bubbles or keep ourselves away from those labels in a way that's not constructive, but rather invite curiosity about one another in practice. And really seeing people do that in real time and sort of the color come back to our faces around really difficult subjects. You could actually feel the hope kind of enter into people again. Doesn't mean it was easy, and it doesn't. It's not easy now, but we can see sort of that glimmer of hope when we are committed to the principles and to the skill building, with some sense that we could actually do these things together. We could drive progress together. So those are hopeful stories, that I hope people can see for themselves in real time and are inspired by, as they go into their own work. I think that the invitation for anyone here is to say, how do you engage in those courageous conversations in your own philanthropies, in your own spaces of work, and how could we partner with you to help facilitate some of those principles and skill building as well?
You've talked a fair amount about, and I want to kind of pull this out a little bit, is around the skill building and the skills and the practice. And I'm curious about, well, let me let me just pause because I did catch a little hallelujah. I gotta talk from that in terms of just feeling a little bit like to have some hope, and that what we can kind of do in this collective space is share those stories. I so often work in the context of service where the idea is we couldn't possibly talk about that. We did that and it went so terribly wrong. Not now. There's so many of those kinds of spaces, but to hear about, and I'm sure it's also possible here, that those conversations can be generative, can be painful, but can also move towards healing is really important. So I appreciate the kind of, you both kind of highlighted those as kind of opportunities, but you've also both mentioned this piece that I want to lean into a little bit more about skill building and resources. I'm very curious about what it takes as a person to be resourced to do this work. You've invoked the personal and organizational. What does it take for us to be resourced to do this work? Do you both have a sense about the principles, the resources that it helps? You've mentioned outside facilitation, which I think is a great one for us to kind of think about. But also, what are the other principles that you'd like to evoke, skills that you'd like for us to kind of think about? Either of you want to jump into those?
Sure. Well, I have a printed copy of the Bridging Differences playbook from Greater Good Science Center on my desk.
Plug. Yeah.
In all seriousness, one of the things I feel so lucky about is getting to know and work with a lot of great organizations in the bridging and pluralism world, and have taken a lot of the methods and question prompts and tools, try to apply them in my own life. And we do that in our own team at Einhorn Collaborative. I try to do that in my home with my 4- and 6-year-old when we're navigating tension and division. And, I think there are some really user-friendly, like low-lift ways to bring those kinds of research-backed skills into our everyday interactions. When I think about some of the question prompts that efforts like StoryCorps' One Small Step and the People's Supper put forward to just take conversations to a place of curiosity and open-mindedness and goodwill, that is crucial, right? You talk about the importance of assuming good intentions, right, as a core strategy in bridging work. And there are prompts and cues that I think can create the conditions for goodwill to emerge. And again, I think we did this somewhat intuitively in our early shaping work in Pluralist, but we were also pulling on some of the specific practices and skills that we've learned by supporting and learning from the great work out in this field.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll say, not too much more than what John said. You named a lot of great groups and organizations that we're working with, but rather, I think maybe even issue sort of a call to adopting a paradigm, or a framework of what incentivizes or what the drivers are for any organization doing this work, right? So again, I said that sometimes we use the word pluralism. How does a person define pluralism? Like, what does that mean? And sometimes it's used synonymously with diversity. But I think that in order to have a real chance at deploying or living into pluralism, sort of building the culture of belonging, right? Really provoking through empowerment, collaboration, and then innovative solution making to complex problems, we do have to invite diversity in and of itself, and then the skills that are then demanded when that diversity creates an uncertainty, right? Mm-hmm. About what it means to actually live and connect with one another. And then from there, we actually have to create value with one another, right? So what cements us in this work is that we are value creating. We are creating something good together, having navigated through our differences, right? Having widened the circle, having really developed a commitment to the repair, right? Of harms, things like that feel so existential to us individually or even insular with our own organizations. Finding that framework or that paradigm can lead us to something that is truly value creating, not just for ourselves personally, but for our organizations and for society, I think gets to some degree part of the answer to your question about how are we resourced or sourced intrinsically to continue to do the work when it's hard, right? We have to have a sense of value creation in order to know that it's meaningful or that it's working, right? And without that, I don't think we'll continue to drink from the pool of pluralistic life. I guess that really does make the world a better place.
What I hear you both kind of talking about is the opportunity within such a convening like this to kind of think about the tools that are available, the principles that are available. And I also hear the opportunity to think about, I mean, hope is one of the things that's really kind of coming out clear. You know, I invoke the kind of exhausted majority, but I invoke exhausted in many different ways, whether it's from, you know, as you talked about the political strife in 2016, the pandemic was a thing. And also the pandemics of racialized violence, gun violence, you know, there's a lot of us in these multiple spaces that are just trying to be human. So to hear these stories about how we can create value when so many of us have been frankly tapped out is an opportunity for kind of hope, and that there are principles, tools, evidence-based kind of techniques, and also ancestral wisdom of what it takes to be in relationship that I hear you both kind of speaking about. I have 38 more questions, but apparently so do other folks. So I'm going to jump into one of the questions that's already been in here. You've hit upon this in some different ways, but just an opportunity to kind of land back. So the question that I see within the chat here is, what are some of the examples or issues of areas that you had to work through together where you saw, and I think you've talked about that, but in particular, where you saw things differently? Where you maybe came to the table and really saw things differently. Brendan, you've kind of highlighted perhaps even the definition of what pluralism means. John, you've also hinted at some other pieces, but was there anything else that kind of comes to mind about what it meant to kind of come together at the table with something that really felt like a fundamental difference or a difference in defining?
Yeah, just to hit a high level, a yes on the definition of pluralism, certainly. You know, I think that we just had, you know, a ton of time together, locked in a cage, to talk about some of those things. What does it mean? And I think that there's still some ongoing work, on what do we mean when we say. I think generally speaking, we're on the bullseye, for that group of people that came together initially. But then we're finding that when it comes to practice, right, that there are different ways in which people see that practice or have certain priorities within the practice, right? Things that are non-negotiables in that practice. I think we're still navigating, the range of expression of pluralism that's still in line with the principles we articulated, right? And I think the other thing, that not a disagreement per se, but more of a process, which is what does change look like? What is the ideal state, that we're all looking for? When we say culture of belonging, what does that mean? What are the outcomes and the outputs, that are signs that we've accomplished it or that we're successful? I think that we're still, raising those questions, and that there should be a hopeful curiosity, about what that means, for us now. You mentioned hope, Allison. I think that this is the thing. It's like, it's not that we're saying that we have all of the answers as a part of this collaborative, but it is saying that we have an invitation now to some sort of a prophetic hope, right? Something emergent, that if we can lean into these principles and then start to practice more consistently, then we can navigate through even the differences of what it means to express pluralism, what it means to move with progress towards the change that we want to see, so that we have a more comprehensive way or more holistic way of living together in this country. So yeah, John.
Yeah, well said, Brandon. I think we also had to navigate some fundamental differences coming in around what kind of actor new pluralists would be in this work, which, it's like a uniquely philanthropic kind of debate or conversation to be having perhaps, but we set up New Pluralists as a pooled fund, as a funder collaborative from the beginning. And I think for some who joined, the mental model was we will simply deploy grant resources towards a range of organizations and initiatives and be a kind of traditional funder, so to speak. And then there were other views that actually New Pluralists can be a catalytic actor that uses a whole range of assets, not just our financial resources, to help to strengthen and knit together and nurture this ecosystem. I think we've landed in a really exciting kind of hybrid place where we are doing obviously like robust grant making, and that's our core sort of purpose, but we're also taking a range of other kinds of actions to try to support pluralism on the ground and through narrative work and so on, and also to grow and strengthen this ecosystem, and frankly, convince and encourage more funders to actually embrace this work, whether as funders themselves or again through the practice change that we're trying to spread. And so that multifaceted theory of change that we've aligned on together was a process of some rumbling and, figuring out where we had sufficient common ground and where we had to reconcile some really different points of view. And again, I think got us to a better place than if we had just like hung tight to our own conviction and mental models, or if we had just done all this work on our own.
I hear you both also kind of pointing to the hope and the opportunities. So in the articulation of the challenges and some of the difficulties is also some of the places to grow, the places for some hope as well. So I see a couple of questions that have come in, but I also want to be conscientious that we really want you all to have an opportunity to talk with each other a bit. And so we're going to gear up for, and perhaps there's a slide that will help us with this, gear up for you all kind of spending some time together. I will get these questions and feed them to the panelists, and we'll see how we can kind of circle back. But what we're going to have an opportunity to do is, again, to kind of create and to kind of be in community with each other. So we're going to send you off into the internet to do a breakout group. We'll share the kind of questions within the breakout group, so don't worry, you don't have to stare at this now. But basically, it's an opportunity for you to get to know other people in the space, and also for us to lean into this idea that you've both invoked around curiosity. What are you curious about? And also, what are you doing in terms of bridging work? We'd love to kind of get a sense from you all about what that's like. So we're going to send you into these rooms. You'll have around 12-ish minutes in those spaces, and then we're going to come on back and also share a little bit about what's going to come up. We also do frame this as kind of a beginning or a continuation of a conversation, not rather the ending of it. So I know that you all are going to be hungry for more, but that's okay. So I'm going to turn it over to the magical powers that be to open up the groups and send you all off to connect with each other in these ways.
You should be moved automatically for about 12 minutes, and there'll be a countdown.
Welcome on back. We have about 20 more seconds before people get yanked from the Ethernet and come on back. All right, it looks like we have folks returning. This is always my favorite moment because I get to catch people on screen that weren't before. I'm like, okay. So it's good to see folks. Welcome on back in that space. So we have a couple of different minutes. We have a couple of minutes to share out from your conversations. Invite folks to either enter into the chat anything that they felt like they learned or resonated or were curious about. And then we also just have 1 to 2 minutes that perhaps someone wants to unmute and talk a little bit about what that experience was like. Who did you get to meet? What kind of came up? So does anyone want to be brave and either enter into the chat or unmute just to talk a little bit about what came up? And then if not, go ahead.
I can talk just because Marie from my group brought up them implementing broader enforcement of their grantees having an anti-hate policy. And I thought that was a really good concept, and talking about the pushback she had on that, but also the successes and trust building she had on that. She kind of got cut off, so if she wants to say anything more, that's kind of why I also talked. Yeah. But it was a good experience.
That's great to hear. Does anyone, Marie, go ahead.
I can talk more or less. Yeah, so we are working on, there's always been policies in place for grantees. But it's been a little bit inconsistent with like our other operations, like making sure that fund holders, people who have DAFs and things know we're not going to grant to these organizations. We will be doing these screenings. We do them, but it just hasn't been super, open. And we have a one-day giving event that gets a lot of attention around here and raises millions of dollars once a year. And so this was the first year that we implemented the anti-hate and anti-discrimination policy for that. And that was the kind of like lightning rod for lots of organizations they didn't have a problem with anti-discrimination as much as they did with anti-hate. So, we're a small community foundation. We've got, $200 million in assets, but we only have 14 people on staff. So we were dealing with like a huge communications PR situation with a bunch of organizations kind of coming after us, pulling out of this event that we just host. We don't make any money out of. So it's been interesting to see how like implementing, one thing I shared was like, we're implementing sort of minimal, to me, it seems minimal for the goal, policies and things, and to see how even with some of those minimal things, it can be a challenge. And like she said, like Gabrielle said, like it's also gained trust of a lot of organizations that maybe didn't see the community foundation as a destination for them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for lifting up that as a story. Again, one of the things that we're really eager to have an opportunity to do is to lift up the narratives and the stories. And, it's lessons learned, but it's also kind of shared relational experiences as well. What you both are kind of talking about, I think resonates very much with one of the questions that kind of came in. There was a question that I really read as like, again, what does it take for the actual people to do this? The actual, Marie, you just kind of talked about staff of 14 dealing with relational pieces, like to think about us as actual humans that have to have the capacity to really do that can be really challenging. I'm also seeing within the chat that, that the time went by really fast, which is always a good thing. And also there were opportunities to kind of hear from others and to learn a little bit from each other and hopefully, again, get curious. So, we're really hoping to continue this as a conversation, and we have a Bridging Differences cohort, which is going to be our opportunity to hopefully bring folks in. And for us to do a couple different things, one of which is to try to pull together this kind of conversation that we had about the resources that it takes, what the science kind of says about it. And I want to do both the science and our lived experiences, the wisdom that is here within these groups. What does it really say? And what's the evidence say about what works to do things like create shared identities, shared values, how we can listen radically. And also what I heard Marie and Gabrielle, you talk about, how do we set boundaries? How are those boundaries also the ways that we kind of live with and kind of keep ourselves, safe? So we are going to have this opportunity as a cohort to kind of come together and to take a look at what I kind of call is like the nerdy, dry science, but to kind of make it come to life with what you all are doing. So that's the opportunity that we'd really love to kind of continue and leverage these kind of stories and experiences, and also be kind of frank. I also hope it's an opportunity to resource ourselves with hope, with connection, with the beautiful smiles that I see. It's nice people wearing red, whatever it is, these small kind of community opportunities to kind of to know that we're not alone in doing this work. As such, I really want to kind of turn to our guests, Jonathan and Brandon, and really thank you. Thank you for the stewardship and the leadership that you all have taken with your compatriots to kind of create this as an opportunity, but also thank you for coming to this space and sharing your stories and your wisdom with us. I know that we'd like a whole lot more. We'd like to hear and engage more, and I'm sure there's other opportunities for that. But I really do want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing, all of you that stayed on the call, the amazing third that hung in there through a turn and talk. So thanks for coming to the space. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen and the host to have them wrap it up. But my gratitude to you all, and thank you for sharing the hope and opportunities as well.
Wonderful. And thank you, Allison. It was great having you facilitate this conversation and bring so much wisdom from your tremendous work. And I will also just thank John and Brandon for really animating this conversation for us and making it feel really real. If you as participants got something out of today's conversation, I'd really encourage you to consider applying to the Bridging Differences cohort. The link for the cohort application is in the chat, and applications are due on March 3rd. This is going to be a great experience, and we have a huge and lovely lineup of speakers who are going to be joining us for those sessions. So we're excited to bring them into the space too. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for sticking through and chatting with each other. And we hope to see you at another council event very soon.